So here's the deal. In physics, we use math. There's been a lot of people that have asked, hey, is this a math class? And the answer is no, it's really not. It's a science class. We learn about nature. But what you need to understand is that we can't separate physics from math. Truthfully, everything is math. Math is the language of the universe. We can reduce every single thing, even the words I'm saying, down to math. But especially when we get to physics, when we begin to describe the physical world around us and quantify the frequency of my voice, for instance, we need to use numbers. And we need to use numbers and math to be able to predict one variable by knowing another. And so in this class, we are going to do some algebra. Um, for regular physics, it's going to be relatively decreased. There's going to be some math, but as far as how much role that math plays in your grade in the course, I'm going to do the best I can to make sure that it's as little as possible. In other words, if you still know the physics behind this stuff, that's my biggest concern. And you can still get 3/4 of the points on a particular question, even if you get the math wrong. Having said that, math is a really big tool that we use in this class. And so if you don't know how to use the tool very well, just to be honest with you, you're going to not have as good of a time in here. So the very first thing we want to do up front is do an algebra review. Again, it's called review because all of this should be a review for you. You should be able to recognize that these things have already been covered before. All of this should be Algebra 1 material. The only algebra we do in here is basic algebra, and we're going to go through those right now. All right, so first of all, the first thing that we need to talk about in terms of algebra review is just some terms, just to get down some vocabulary so that we understand what we're talking about. These are the terms that I'm going to talk about here. The words equation, variable, substitute, solve, term, constant, exponent, simplify, and distribute. All of those terms I'm going to talk about in just in the next few minutes. All right, so let's first talk about the term equation. Now, before I do this, some of you might be sitting there thinking like, why is he doing this? We took this in Algebra 1. Yeah, I know. But first of all, you guys have had like 6 months of basically educational laziness, and it's not your fault. So I really want to get you up to speed. And I just find that there are a lot of people who just don't have a really good understanding of these terms. So if you know this stuff, that's great. Fast forward through it. If you don't, this is for you. So the term equation. And by the way, some of these you may think they know that you know what they mean. And this is true with a lot of words in this class. But there's a very specific definition that we need in here. So when I say the word equation, obviously an equation has a right and a left side. There's an equal sign in the middle. We get that. There's only two sides to an equation. Sometimes we use the word formula in physics to substitute for the word equation because we use formulas to kind of calculate certain concepts, quantities in this class. But in this class, it's really important that you understand that the word equation means no numbers yet, only letters, which are called variables, and that's the next term that we're going to talk about. So there are very specific equations for very specific topics in this class. For instance, we will use this equation. This is one of the equations we will use to talk about motion that has to do with acceleration motion, also called kinematics. This equation right here, rho equals mv, is about momentum. This equation here is a very famous one, sigma F equals ma, has to do with force equals mass times acceleration. Very specific equations in this class. And again, when we say the word equation, I mean the equation with no numbers entered in yet, just letters, just variables. We have a whole sheet of equations that we're going to talk about in this class, but we're going to get to them one at a time. So that's what we mean by the word equation. The next term that I've already mentioned is the word variable. Variable is simply a letter representing a quantity or a number in an equation. And again, the variables are very specific in this class because for the first time, when you took algebra, those letters didn't mean anything. An X was an X, a Y was a Y. It didn't mean anything at all. Well, now we need to understand that these letters mean very specific things. every single time we use them. So for instance, the letter D always stands for distance. The letter V always stands for speed. F is force, etc., etc. There's all kinds of variables in this class, and they all stand for something very specific. It's really important that you pay attention to the case of the variable. That means uppercase or lowercase. If you see a capital F, make sure you write a capital F, not a lowercase f, because capital F happens to be force. Lowercase f is something completely different. In our case, in our class, it's frequency. If it's a lowercase t, write a lowercase t, that's time, not uppercase t. Uppercase t stands for something else called period. So that is what the term variable means. It's just a letter representing a quantity. Last one we'll talk about on this video is the word substitute. All right, so we're going to take the previous two words, variable, and we're going to replace the variables in an equation with known quantities or numbers. Sometimes those known quantities are called givens, and that's because they are given to you in the problem. For instance, you might have a problem that says something like this: a car can travel 5 meters in 1 second. What is its speed? Well, in this case, our givens or our known quantities are 5 meters. 5 meters happens to be our distance, which is represented by the variable d. 1 second is our given for time. That's time, which is represented by the variable t. So we have our d, we have our t. Those are our givens and our known quantities. And what we're going to do is substitute those into a specific equation. I'll show you that on the camera in just a second. And when we substitute it in, here's the cool part. After substitution, all of a sudden your equation with letters has now become an expression. So let's look at substitution. So the very first equation that we're going to learn in this class is this one right here, v equals d over t. Remember, these variables stand for something. This says speed equals distance divided by time. And as we saw in the problem that I just showed you, we saw that our distance was 5 meters. We saw that our time was 1 second. So when we substitute, all we're going to do is, this is inequality. We're going to take this number and replace the variable in the equation with that number. And then we're going to rewrite the thing with the numbers instead of the variables. I'm going to leave v the way it is because in this case, this problem was asking us to solve for speed. So since that's what I'm looking for, I'm going to leave it. Now, really important in this case, do not put an x, do not put a y, don't put a blank, don't do any of that. Leave the variable the way it was in the equation originally. That's really important. Our d becomes a 5. I choose to substitute in parentheses. I'll tell you more about that later. Our t becomes a 1. Now we get v equals 5 over 1, and this is really simply v equals 5. That's what substitution means. We're simply taking numbers and replacing the variables that they stand for with those numbers.